Imagine snapping your leg right now. No hospital, no ambulance, no pain medication waiting in a cabinet. Just you, the pain, and whoever happens to be standing nearby. What did our prehistoric ancestors actually do when their bodies were injured? You might assume the answer is simple. They suffered. They died. Survival of the fittest. And anyone who got badly hurt just got quietly removed from the gene pool. The real archaeological record tells a very different story. And it starts inside the mouths of people who died 50,000 years ago, at a cave called El Sidrón, in northern Spain. Researchers led by archaeologist Karen Hardy examined the fossilized dental plaque of several Neanderthals using a technique called gas chromatography, a method that identifies chemical compounds trapped inside ancient material, buried in the hardened plaque on one individual's teeth. Hardy's team found chemical signatures matching two very specific plants, yarrow and chamomile. Here's why that detail matters so much. Neither plant offers any real nutritional value. Both taste bitter. And earlier genetic research on these same Neanderthal remains had already confirmed they carried a gene called TAS2R38, the same gene that lets you detect bitter flavors today. In other words, this individual could absolutely taste how unpleasant these plants were, and ate them anyway. Why would anyone deliberately choke down a bitter, nutritionally useless plant? Because yarrow and chamomile are two of the oldest documented medicinal herbs on the planet. Yarrow has been used for centuries to clean wounds and slow bleeding. Chamomile calms inflammation and digestive distress. Hardy's team concluded the most plausible explanation wasn't taste. It was self-medication, deliberately chosen despite the unpleasant flavor. The same way you might choke down a bitter medicine today because you know it'll help. So Neanderthals weren't just enduring injury and illness. Somewhere in their accumulated knowledge, passed down without a single written word, they knew which plants fought pain and which ones fought infection. Let's jump forward roughly 45,000 years, to a body found frozen in the Alps in 1991, and to one of the strangest medical discoveries in modern history. Ötzi, the mummified man who died around 5,300 years ago, was covered in 61 tattoos, mapped in detail by researchers including Marco Samadelli. These weren't decorative designs. They were simple lines and dots, clustered almost entirely around his joints, his lower spine, and his knees. When researchers cross-referenced the tattoo locations against Ötzi's own skeleton, they found something remarkable. X-rays revealed degeneration and arthritis in nearly every single spot where a tattoo had been placed. Here's the detail that should genuinely surprise you. Roughly 80% of Ötzi's tattoos line up almost exactly with acupuncture points still used in traditional Chinese medicine today, a practice not documented in writing for another 2,000 years. Nobody is claiming Ötzi's community had contact with ancient China. What the evidence suggests instead is something arguably more interesting, that pain relief through targeted skin puncture may have been independently discovered by more than one human culture, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. Because the underlying idea, targeted stimulation relieving chronic pain, kept getting rediscovered wherever humans lived long enough to suffer from the same worn-out joints. Ötzi wasn't just tattooed for treatment. He was carrying his own medicine cabinet, tucked into his belongings. Researchers found pieces of Piptoporus botulinus, a fungus that grows on birch trees and is now confirmed, through modern chemical analysis, to have genuine antibacterial and anti-inflammatory properties. He also carried bracken fern, a plant historically used to treat intestinal parasites, and traces of moss consistent with primitive wound dressing. This wasn't guesswork. This was a walking case study in applied medical knowledge, refined enough that a man living over 5,000 years ago carried purpose-built remedies for the specific ailments plaguing his own body. But self-medication and herbal remedies are one thing. What did prehistoric humans do when the injury was catastrophic? When it wasn't a sore joint, but a shattered skull? This is where the story gets almost unbelievable. And it starts with a diplomat, not a doctor. In 1865, an American commissioner in Peru named Ephraim George Squire was given an unusual gift, a skull from an ancient Incan burial ground, with a neat, rectangular hole cut cleanly into the top. Squire suspected it was evidence of deliberate surgery, performed while the person was still alive. Skeptical colleagues in New York doubted it. So Squire carried the skull across the Atlantic to consult the era's leading expert on human anatomy, a French surgeon named Paul Broca. Broca examined the bone around the hole closely and reached a stunning conclusion. The edges weren't jagged, like a fresh injury. They were smooth and rounded, showing clear signs of healing. This person hadn't just survived having a piece of their skull removed. They had lived long enough afterward for new bone to grow back around the wound. This procedure is called trepanation, cutting an opening into the skull. And it turns out Squire's skull was nowhere near unique. Anthropologist John Verano, after studying more than 800 trepan skulls recovered across Peru, found survival rates in later periods reaching as high as 80%, a figure that would have embarrassed most American hospitals during the Civil War, fought with metal instruments roughly 1,000 years later. Read that again. Ancient surgeons, cutting into the skull with stone and obsidian tools. No anesthesia, no antibiotics, no understanding of germs at all. Achieved survival rates that rivaled or beat those of trained physicians operating with metal scalpels centuries later. So how did they get so good at something this dangerous? Verano's research suggests the answer is depressingly practical. Trepanation became common in Peru largely because of warfare. Skull fractures from slings and war clubs were common enough that surgeons got tremendous amounts of practice, refining their technique across generations of trial, error, and careful observation of what actually helped a patient survive. Let's reconstruct a single moment from this story. Using everything you now know, a hunter returns to camp with a shattered leg. The bone bent at an angle it was never meant to bend. The group doesn't abandon him. Someone splints the limb using straight branches lashed tightly with sinew cord, immobilizing the break the same way a modern cast would. Someone else crushes yarrow leaves between two stones, packing the bitter green paste against an open wound to slow the bleeding. Nearby, an elder who survived a childhood head injury watches closely, remembering, in whatever way people remembered before written language existed, exactly which plant worked and which one didn't. Nobody in that scene has a medical degree, but somebody in that group has become the community's memory for what to do when a body breaks. Is that splint scene just a guess? Or is there real physical proof that fractures were deliberately treated rather than simply left to heal on their own? There's real proof, and it comes from the bones themselves. Paleopathologists studying skeletal remains across multiple prehistoric sites have identified healed fractures where the bone knitted back together in near-perfect alignment, rather than the crooked, twisted healing pattern you'd expect from a broken limb left completely untouched. A leg bone that heals straight, instead of bent at an angle, is exactly the kind of evidence researchers look for as an indirect signature of splinting, because bone simply doesn't reset itself into correct alignment without something holding it steady while it mends. Some of these healed injuries were severe enough, based on the type of fracture, that the individual would have been completely unable to walk, hunt, or gather food for weeks or months afterward. Yet they survived, which means someone else was providing food, water, and protection the entire time they couldn't provide it for themselves. Here's the counterintuitive twist buried underneath all of this. You'd assume that prehistoric medicine was primitive superstition, a shot in the dark performed out of desperation. The evidence points somewhere else entirely. Every single case you've just heard, the deliberate bitter herbs, the tattoos placed precisely over degenerated joints, the trepanation survival rate climbing steadily over centuries, shows the same underlying pattern: careful observation, refined technique, and knowledge passed forward because it demonstrably worked. Ancient medicine wasn't the absence of science. It was science running on a different kind of memory, stored in oral tradition and muscle memory instead of textbooks, tested against the harshest possible peer review, whether the patient lived or died. Now bring this back to you, sitting wherever you're sitting. One pharmacy visit away from painkillers, one phone call away from an ambulance. Every time you take an aspirin, you're distantly, chemically related to a Neanderthal choosing bitter yarrow over a tasteless meal because they understood, in some form, that suffering now might mean healing later. Every time a doctor sets a broken bone in a cast, they're running a refined version of the exact same splint a hunter-gatherer used tens of thousands of years before anyone wrote down the word medicine. So, what did our prehistoric ancestors do when their bodies were injured? They didn't just endure it. They studied it. They experimented, generation after generation, on the only laboratory available to them, each other, and astonishingly often, against every disadvantage you'd expect. It actually worked. Snap your leg again, in your mind, one more time, except now, instead of silence and abandonment, picture someone kneeling beside you, already reaching for the right plant,